The bright red lights of the ambulance flashed as it sped through the empty streets late at night. Inside, Emily lay on the stretcher, her face pale, her hands gripping the sides tightly. She was only 14, but tonight she felt much older. Pain twisted inside her stomach, making it hard to breathe. The paramedic spoke softly to her, trying to keep her calm, but fear had already taken over. Beside her, Emily's mother, Linda, sat with her hands shaking. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched her daughter struggle. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice cracked. She was trying to be strong, but the fear in her heart was unbearable. She didn't know what was happening to her daughter, and that was the worst part. The ambulance finally pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, and the doors swung open. Nurses and doctors were already waiting. The paramedics quickly wheeled Emily inside as she groaned in pain. The hospital lights were too bright, making everything look cold and unfamiliar. People rushed past, voices filled the air, but Emily could only focus on the burning pain inside her. Dr. Carter, an experienced doctor, stepped forward. His calm eyes met Emily's as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "We're going to take care of you." His voice was steady, reassuring, but Emily couldn't shake the deep fear in her chest. Linda tried to follow, but a nurse held her back for a moment. "We need to assess her quickly," the nurse said. "Please wait here for a few minutes." Linda hesitated, not wanting to leave Emily's side, but she nodded, wiping her tears away. Inside the examination room, the nurses moved quickly. One of them checked Emily's pulse, another adjusted the IV, and a third asked her questions. "How long have you been feeling this pain?" one nurse asked. Emily hesitated. She wanted to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. She glanced around the room, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt frozen. Dr. Carter noticed her hesitation. He knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Emily, I need you to tell me the truth so I can help you. Is there something you're afraid of?" Emily's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. A tear slipped down her cheek as she looked into the doctor's kind eyes. She had been holding on to a secret for so long, and it felt like it was crushing her from the inside. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the hospital blanket. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said something that made Dr. Carter pause. And in that moment, everything changed. Dr. Carter carefully observed Emily as she lay on the hospital bed, her breathing uneven. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors. A nurse adjusted the IV, while another gently wiped the sweat from Emily's forehead. Linda stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together, watching with worried eyes. Emily's face was pale, her body tense. She had been rushed here in pain, but now, as she lay on the hospital bed, something seemed different. Dr. Carter noticed it right away. He had treated many young patients before, and he could always tell when something wasn't right. "Emily," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" Emily swallowed hard. Her lips trembled as she nodded slightly. She could feel her mother's gaze on her, full of concern, but she didn't look in her direction. "How long have you been feeling this pain?" Dr. Carter asked, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "A few weeks," Emily whispered. Linda gasped. "You never told me," she said, stepping closer. "Why didn't you say anything, sweetheart?" Emily looked away, her fingers nervously gripping the edge of the blanket. She didn't answer. Dr. Carter noticed her hesitation again. It wasn't just fear of the pain. There was something else, something deeper. One of the nurses wrote down notes on a clipboard, glancing at Dr. Carter for direction. He nodded slightly, signaling her to continue with the routine checkup. "Have you had any other symptoms?" he asked. Emily hesitated again. "I feel weak sometimes," she admitted, "and sometimes I feel sick." Dr. Carter listened carefully. "Emily, I want to do a quick exam, just to make sure everything is okay," he said. "If at any point you feel uncomfortable, just let me know, all right?" Emily nodded again, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken. As Dr. Carter gently placed a stethoscope against her chest, he could hear her rapid heartbeat. She was nervous, too nervous. "Emily," he said after a moment, setting the stethoscope down, "is there something you want to tell me?" Emily's eyes flickered with emotion, but she didn't speak. The room felt heavier, the silence stretching between them. Linda took a step forward, reaching for her daughter's hand, but Emily pulled away slightly. Dr. Carter exchanged a quick glance with the nurse. He had seen this kind of hesitation before. It wasn't just about being sick. There was something more, something she was afraid to say. Taking a deep breath, he spoke softly. "Emily, you're safe here. Whatever it is, you can tell me." A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She clenched her hands together, her body trembling. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she finally said, "There's something I need to tell you, but you have to promise to listen first." Dr. Carter leaned in slightly, his expression gentle. "I'm listening," he assured her. Emily took another shaky breath, preparing to reveal the truth that would change everything. Dr. Carter sat still, his eyes focused on Emily. He could see her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the hospital blanket tightly. Her mother, Linda, took a step closer, but Emily didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on the doctor, as if she had finally found someone she could trust. The room felt heavy with silence. The nurses paused their work, sensing that something important was about to be said. Dr. Carter remained calm, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Emily, whatever you need to tell me, I'm here to listen. You're safe." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. I haven't told anyone before," she whispered. Her voice was so soft that Dr. Carter had to lean in slightly to hear her clearly. Linda's face was filled with confusion and worry. "Sweetheart, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated, her fingers curled into fists, and her breathing became uneven. The weight of her secret had been crushing her for so long. Now that she had the chance to speak, it felt harder than she expected. But she knew she had to say it. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. "I'm not really pregnant," she said. For a moment, there was complete silence. Linda's eyes widened in shock. What do you mean?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. Dr. Carter didn't react with surprise. Instead, he kept his expression calm, his years of experience allowing him to remain steady. He had suspected that something was off, but he hadn't expected this. Emily's voice cracked as she continued. "I made it all up," she admitted. "I faked everything. The symptoms, the weight gain, even the sickness." Linda gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "But why? Why would you do that?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, but more came. "Because I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice breaking. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly. "Emily, can you tell me why you felt you had to do this?" he asked gently. Emily took a shaky breath. She had been keeping this secret for so long, but now that she had started speaking, it was like a dam had broken. "I was scared," she admitted. "I thought, if people believed I was pregnant, someone would take me to a doctor. Someone would listen. Someone would help me." Linda's face was filled with confusion. "Help you? Help you from what?" she asked. Emily lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. "From something I can't escape," she whispered. Dr. Carter's heart tightened. He had seen fear in many patients before, but the way Emily looked at him now, it was the kind of fear that told him she had been hiding something much deeper. He gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily, you don't have to be afraid anymore," he said softly. "You're here now. Whatever it is, we will help you." Emily looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to believe his words, but the truth she was about to reveal would change everything. Taking another deep breath, She prepared to say the words that had been trapped inside her for too long. Emily's hands trembled as she wiped her tears. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest. She had been holding on to this secret for so long, afraid of what would happen if she spoke the truth. But now, sitting in the hospital bed with Dr. Carter's kind eyes watching her, she knew she couldn't keep it inside any longer. Linda stood frozen, confusion and worry mixed on her face. She couldn't understand what her daughter was saying. "Emily, please," she whispered. "Tell me what's going on." Emily took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to make people believe I was pregnant because I thought it was the only way someone would notice me. The only way someone would ask me questions." Dr. Carter nodded, his voice calm. "Notice you? Emily, what do you mean by that?" Emily clenched her fists. She had practiced this moment in her head 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt too heavy to say. Her body felt cold, and tears welled up in her eyes again. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought, if I was taken to a doctor, maybe someone would realize something was wrong. Maybe someone would help me." Linda's breathing quickened. "Help you? Emily, you could have told me. I'm your mother." Her voice cracked with emotion. Emily's lips quivered as she shook her head. "No, Mom, I couldn't." Dr. Carter remained silent, allowing Emily to speak at her own pace. He knew that whatever she was about to say was something that had been locked inside her for a long time. Emily took another shaky breath. "I felt trapped," she whispered. "I felt like there was no way out." Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a deep, painful silence. Linda's eyes filled with tears as she slowly sat down in the chair beside the hospital bed. "Emily, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Emily looked at Dr. Carter, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I needed to be here, in this hospital, where I could finally talk to someone," she said. "I needed someone to see me, to ask me questions, to notice that something wasn't right." Dr. Carter placed a gentle hand on hers. "Emily, I see you," he said softly. "And I promise, we will help you." A fresh wave of tears ran down Emily's cheeks, but this time, they were different. They weren't just tears of fear, they were also tears of relief. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. She had finally spoken the truth, and now there was no turning back. Emily's chest rose and fell as she took deep, shaky breaths. She had finally spoken the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. But now that they were out in the open, she felt more vulnerable than ever. Her mother sat in silence, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. Dr. Carter remained calm, his gaze steady, waiting for Emily to continue at her own pace. Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart, what do you mean you felt trapped? Trapped where?" Emily hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. Her heart pounded, and for a brief moment, she thought about staying silent. But something inside her had shifted. This was her chance to finally get help. With a trembling voice, she said, "At home." Linda gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. "What? Emily, what are you saying?" Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I was scared all the time," she admitted. "Every day, I felt like I was walking on thin ice. I couldn't speak, I couldn't breathe without feeling afraid." Dr. Carter's eyes softened with understanding. "Emily, was someone hurting you?" he asked gently. Emily's lips trembled as she nodded. Her whole body felt weak, like all the strength had been drained from her. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "I thought, if I pretended to be pregnant, someone would take me to a doctor. Someone would ask me questions, and maybe, just maybe, I could finally tell the truth." Linda covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, shaking her head. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily looked at her mother with sad, tired eyes. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me," she admitted. "And even if you did, I was afraid of what would happen next." Dr. Carter reached for Emily's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "You did the right thing by speaking up," he said softly. "And I promise you are safe now." Emily let out a small sob, her shoulders shaking. For so long, she had carried this weight alone, unsure if she would ever find a way out. But now, sitting in this hospital room, surrounded by people who finally saw her pain, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Dr. Carter glanced at the nurse beside him and gave a small nod. She understood immediately and discreetly stepped out of the room to notify hospital security. They had to act quickly, but they also had to be careful. Emily had finally spoken the truth, and now it was their job to protect her. Linda reached for her daughter's hands, gripping them tightly. "I believe you, Emily," she said through her tears. "And I am so sorry." Emily looked at her mother, searching her face for any doubt, but there was none. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt heard. And for the first time, she truly believed that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Emily's tears continued to fall, but something inside her felt lighter. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long was slowly loosening. She had finally spoken the truth, and for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. Dr. Carter remained calm, his voice steady as he spoke. "Emily, I know this was very hard for you, but you are very brave for telling us. And I promise, we are going to help you." Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand. What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter exchanged a glance with the nurse who had stepped back into the room. She gave him a small nod, confirming that everything was in place. He turned back to Emily, his tone gentle. "Right now, the most important thing is making sure you are safe. We have a team here that will talk to you and help you through this." Linda tightened her grip on Emily's hand, her own eyes still filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I should have known something was wrong. I should have seen it." Emily shook her head. "It's not your fault, Mom," she said softly. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared." Linda let out a shaky breath, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I'm here now," she said firmly. "And I won't let you go through this alone." Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile stepped inside. She wore a badge that read Social Worker, Mrs. Taylor. "Hello, Emily," she said in a warm voice. "I'm Mrs. Taylor. I work with young people who have been in difficult situations. Dr. Carter asked me to come and speak with you." Emily hesitated for a moment, her body tensing up again. But when she looked into Mrs. Taylor's kind eyes, she felt a little safer. "You're not in trouble," Mrs. Taylor assured her. "I just want to listen and help in any way I can." Emily took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "Okay." Dr. Carter gave her an encouraging smile. "You're doing great, Emily. Take your time." Mrs. Taylor pulled a chair closer and sat down. "I know you've been very brave already by speaking up," she said, "and I want you to know that you are safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Emily's heart pounded. The words "you are safe" felt strange to hear. She had spent so long living in fear that the idea of safety seemed unreal. She swallowed hard and whispered, What if things don't change?" Mrs. Taylor leaned in slightly, her voice filled with reassurance. "They will, Emily, because you took the first step, and we're going to make sure you get the help and protection you need." Emily blinked away fresh tears. For the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Emily sat in silence, her hands gripping the hospital blanket as she listened to Mrs. Taylor's soothing voice. The words "you are safe now" echoed in her mind, but a small part of her still found it hard to believe. Could things really change? Could she really escape the fear that had controlled her for so long? Dr. Carter gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Emily, I know this feels overwhelming," he said, But I want you to know that you're not alone. We are here for you." Linda, still holding her daughter's hand, wiped away her own tears. "I'm here too, sweetheart," she whispered. "I love you, and I will do everything I can to protect you." Emily looked at her mother, searching her face for doubt, but there was none. Linda's eyes were full of guilt and sorrow, but most of all, they were filled with love. Mrs. Taylor gave Emily a reassuring smile. "Emily, before we go any further, I want you to take a deep breath," she said gently. "You've been so brave, and I know this is a lot to take in." Emily nodded slowly and took a shaky breath. It didn't take away all the fear inside her, but it helped, even just a little. "Now," Mrs. Taylor continued, "I want you to know what's going to happen next. We are going to make sure that you are safe and that you have the support you need. We will take every step carefully, so you don't have to be afraid." Emily hesitated before asking, "Will I have to go back home?" Her voice was small, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor shook her head. "Not if it's not safe for you," she assured her. "That's why we're here, to make sure that doesn't happen." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The thought of going back had terrified her, but knowing that there was a way out gave her hope. Dr. Carter glanced at the clock. "Emily, we will have to run a few more medical tests to make sure you are okay physically," he said, "but I promise we will take things one step at a time." Emily nodded, feeling a little more at ease. She knew there was still a long journey ahead, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. Linda squeezed her hand gently. "We will get through this together," she said firmly. "I will never let you feel alone again." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. But this time, they weren't just tears of fear. They were tears of relief. Mrs. Taylor smiled warmly. "You are incredibly strong, Emily," she said. "And this is just the beginning of a new chapter for you." Emily took another deep breath. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had taken the first step toward freedom. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she would finally be okay. Emily sat quietly, her fingers gently tracing the pattern on the hospital blanket. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long was slowly starting to fade. It wasn't completely gone. She knew it would take time. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Mrs. Taylor's kind voice broke the silence. "Emily, I want you to know that everything you've shared with us is very important. And because of your bravery, we can now take steps to make sure you are safe and protected." Emily nodded slowly. "What happens next?" she asked. Mrs. Taylor exchanged a glance with Dr. Carter before answering. "First, we will make sure you are in a safe place," she explained. "You won't have to go back to any situation that makes you feel scared. We will work with professionals who can help you heal, both physically and emotionally." Linda, sitting beside her daughter, squeezed Emily's hand tightly. "You are not alone in this, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I am here, and I will stand by you through everything." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes again, but this time, they weren't just from pain or fear. They were tears of relief. For so long, she had believed that no one would ever understand, that no one would help. But now, she could see that things were changing. Dr. Carter gave her a reassuring nod. "You've been carrying so much on your shoulders, Emily, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. From now on, you will have people looking out for you." Emily took a deep breath. She had spent so much time feeling trapped, but now she saw a path forward. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. But at least now, she had a chance to move forward, to rebuild, to heal. Mrs. Taylor smiled warmly. "There are counselors and support groups that can help you process everything you've been through," she said. "You don't have to rush. This is your journey, and we will take it one step at a time." Emily looked down at her hands, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. She had been terrified to speak the truth, afraid of what would happen if she did. But now, as she sat in this room with people who genuinely cared, She realized that telling the truth was the most powerful thing she could have done. Linda wiped her own tears and kissed Emily's forehead. "You are so brave," she whispered, "and I love you more than anything in this world." Emily leaned into her mother's embrace, allowing herself to feel comforted. She still had many questions about what the future held, but one thing was certain: she was no longer facing it alone. As she looked up at Mrs. Taylor and Dr. Carter, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And for the first time, she truly believed that she was going to be okay.